when an 18-year-old girl suddenly disappeared off the streets of her hometown in Ecuador, leaving behind a mysterious digital footprint, community attention would turn to a well-known and passionate evangelical pastor, whose popularity was exceeded only by his pompousness. And members of Oasis de Esperanza Community Church would learn the hard way that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Juliana Campoverde was born on August 21st, 1993, in Quito, Ecuador, and was described as a loving and caring girl. In addition to being an outstanding student academically, Juliana was passionate about incorporating music into her everyday life, as demonstrated by one instance when she elected to accompany her cousin Lorena to a hospital where, upon waking up from surgery, Lorena was in immense pain. Juliana comforted her by singing her a local lullaby in their native tongue. However, things would not remain so idyllic, as in 2003, at the age of 10, Juliana and her family made the choice to leave their long-attended evangelical church, and their departure was said to be on unfriendly terms. Her family started attending Oasis de Esperanza. Oasis de Esperanza was an evangelical church close to their home in the Biloxi neighborhood of Quito, and as Juliana was only 10 years old, she would begin attending the youth sessions, run by the church and headed by Pastor Jonathan. The church was established in the year 2000. Run by the Querido family, Jonathan Querido was one of its pastors. Juliana was passionate about her new church. Being a member of its choir, Juliana took great pride in her congregation. Juliana consistently and passionately attended meetings and lectures held by Pastor Jonathan. Juliana's mother recalls that her angelic daughter went practically everywhere with the founders of the church, eventually becoming close friends with Jonathan as well as his extended family. Jonathan, his brothers, and Juliana would frequently go out to eat, and she would walk with them in public. The girl, having not even seen the change of 13 years, was already joining the Querido family in their intimate Christmas festivities. Their frequent group chats via instant messenger did not alarm her mother, at least not in any media reports of the later incident. Juliana was known to take Pastor Jonathan's word as gospel, literally, and with all her heart she would listen to what he had to say with eagerness and passion. The pastors of their church, however, made sure to keep a careful eye on their parishioners. Jonathan's father, Pastor Patricio, expected to be asked for his approval prior to any members, including Juliana's family, engaging in their own projects or simply taking a trip. In some cases, if the parishioners did not pay the tithe, they would put pressure on their members in order to give some money. Sometimes, members of the church even went to the parishioners' places of work in order to warn them that they would not receive any blessings if they did not pay the tithe. Church leaders would blame any illness or ailments that their members had on their lack of payment, and if the parishioners deigned to go on a personal vacation, or even simply got a new job, they would receive phone calls from the pastors asking why the elders had not been informed. By 2010, although Juliana and her family were able to tolerate this church, it was starting to make them more and more uncomfortable, as the local pastors at the church started using their authority to tell the now 16-year-old Juliana who her life partner was destined to be. Her discomfort was not eased by the fact that she had already found herself a boyfriend named Fabian, who she kept hidden from the church. When the elders found out, however, they expelled Juliana from the church choir. Pastor Jonathan, rather than calling this a punishment, instead described her expulsion from the church choir as, quote, a time of rest so that she can stabilize. This deeply affected Juliana, who would frequently cry alone in her room, believing that she had failed Pastor Jonathan and her church. Eventually, though, Juliana was allowed back into the choir. In December of 2011, Juliana received a Facebook friend request from a man identifying himself as a church psychologist. He introduced himself as Juan Solano. Juliana accepted the friend request, and the two began to talk via instant messenger. Juan would ask deeply personal questions about Juliana's romantic life, her interests, if she ever had any sexual partners, and about her future plans. When Juliana stated that she hoped to leave Ecuador in the future and begin studying abroad in Argentina, Juan Solano was very much opposed to the idea and convinced her, via instant messenger, to not go, stating that in going to Argentina, she would be losing valuable time with her friends and family. Juliana told Juan, quote, there are sacrifices that are better to not live through. To which Juan responded, be careful, you can get burned. The two continued their digital conversation, with Juan revealing that he was a widower and that his wife had shared Juliana's name. Juan then started asking Juliana about Pastor Jonathan and why she had not been talking to him. When Juliana explained her actions and the issues that Jonathan had had with her boyfriends, Juan was quick to rush to the pastor's defense, justifying his reactions and describing him as, quote, a wounded lion who, quote, would give his life for his sheep. Juliana thanked Juan for his advice and stated that God had put him in her path to help her. Juliana, however, would later notice Juan's profile pic, and she would send him a single message, stating, quote, you look a lot like Jonathan. Juan never responded to the similarities, but later sent another message to Juliana in which he suddenly told her that she should marry Jonathan's brother. The next time Juliana went to church, she asked Jonathan about this, and he said he would pray and find out if that was true. Coincidentally, and very conveniently, Jonathan told her that this was indeed divine intervention, and that she was destined to marry his brother. Juliana was devastated, as she did not want to marry Jonathan's brother, and was still in a relationship with Fabian. According to Fabian, she stated that she told him, quote, in the church, they had a revelation, that I have to marry someone, and that I cannot disobey God. Not long after, Juliana and Fabian would break up. In the coming months, the pastors would continue to pressure Juliana into marrying Israel Carrillo, Jonathan's brother, telling her to go out with him and to give him a chance. But Juliana felt nothing towards Israel and questioned why God would tell her to marry someone that she did not even know. When she expressed her doubts with Jonathan, he complained that she was not taking her role in this seriously, and when she asked what her role was, Jonathan responded, quote, obedient daughter, to be Israel's wife, what he has for me. Juliana would beg Pastor Jonathan to let her date Fabian, but this was rejected, citing that Fabian was not a member of the church and older than she. In February of 2012, Juliana, still deeply in love with Fabian despite her commitment to her faith, was crying in her room one day when her mother overheard and asked her what was wrong. Juliana finally confessed to her mother what had been going on between her and Pastor Jonathan. When her mother found out what had happened, she was not pleased that Pastor Jonathan was forcing Juliana into a match that she did not want. And after reassuring Juliana that nobody was forcing her to get married, her family would leave the church in June of 2012. That same month, Juliana again would start dating Fabian. On July 7th, 2012, 18-year-old Juliana had just graduated from high school and was saving up money for college. She, alongside her parents, purchased a small shop where she sold health food products. On this day, she and her mother were getting ready to start work. They had breakfast together and then headed out for their jobs. Both walked together from their home to Mariscal Sucre Avenue. On their way to their jobs, they happened to come across Jonathan. They awkwardly greeted him from afar before continuing on their way. However, Juliana's mother thought to herself how very odd it was to come across Pastor Jonathan, as he lived in the northern center of Quito, and his church was currently closed due to the early morning hour. The meeting was understandably tense, and Juliana was nervous and uncomfortable throughout, recalls her mother. The two arrived at a gas station located at the intersection of Mariscal Sucre Avenue and Avaji Avenue. At this point, they went their separate ways. Juliana had to walk 5 more blocks to reach the shop, while her mother took a bus to go to her job. This would be the last time that Juliana was seen alive. 20 minutes later, her mother received a phone call from her husband, asking about Juliana. He stated that he had called her on her cell phone, but that strangely, on the other end, he only heard the sound of children playing, and in the background, the voice of an adult male telling the children to put the phone down as it did not belong to them. In response, her mother called Fabian, and he stated that he had not seen Juliana and that he was supposed to meet her that night. Her mother started calling hospitals, clinics, friends, and members of their new church. However, nobody had seen Juliana. Her mother attempted to call Pastor Jonathan and confront him. However, he never answered the phone. Juliana's family searched the neighborhood and visited various hospitals in case Juliana had been in an accident and was somehow unidentified. However, they were unable to locate her. Eventually, Juliana's mother went to the police, and the response that she got from them was not what she was hoping for. The police acted dismissively, stating that they had to wait 48 hours before filing a report, and came up with callous explanations, stating that, quote, she must have gone on a rampage. They also theorized that she may be pregnant and would be back 9 months later, or that she was simply with her boyfriend and that the family should wait for her to return. After the disappointing police response, her mother would continue to search on her own, constantly calling Juliana's cell phone, only to get no answer. Eventually, she received a text message, supposedly from Juliana, which read as follows, quote, I met a person and I'm going with him as soon as I can. I'll send you the stuff from the shop. Her mother went to see Fabian, and once she saw that Juliana wasn't with him, she showed him the message, telling him that this was not how her daughter would have written or acted. Both went to the police again, only to be met with the same inaction, as the police stated that the text message proved that Juliana had left voluntarily, despite her mother's protests that she did not send the text. The police simply told Juliana's mother again to wait until the daughter returned. Defeated, she returned home and searched Juliana's room, trying to find a note, a message, or anything that would indicate where she might have gone, but she was unable to find anything. The next morning, her mother went to the health food store that they owned to find everything intact and nothing out of place. Even the grapes that were purchased the prior day and money from the purchase was still in the safe. Both Fabian and Juliana's parents returned to the police. However, they continued to drag their feet on the issue, stating that she was likely with her boyfriend. When Fabian told the officer that he was her boyfriend, they simply said, quote, then surely she has another one. Eventually, despite the police's lack of interest, they managed to file a missing persons report. However, hopes for progress were still faint, as a prosecutor would not be able to be assigned to the case until Monday. When the family tried going to the media over the weekend, the media seemed just as disinterested. Eventually, the family had to resort to creating and posting their own missing persons posters in the Biloxi neighborhood. It was while she and Mary Goth, Juliana's aunt, were posting flyers that a police officer, seemingly unaware of his colleague's disinterest in this case, approached her and informed her that the neighborhood did have CCTV cameras. He offered to take the women to the Quito police headquarters in order to see if they could view the footage. Once they arrived, the officers at the Quito police headquarters would only allow Juliana's mother to come inside and view the footage. So she went inside while Juliana's aunt waited for her outside. While outside, Juliana's aunt called Pastor Patricio Carrillo, Jonathan's father, to tell him that Juliana had disappeared, and he reacted incredibly oddly. His response was, quote, I already knew that. I had already seen what was going to happen. Why are they leaving the church? He then asked Juliana's aunt where they were at the moment, and when she replied that they were at Quito Police Headquarters, Patricio did not seem to like the answer, and told the women that they should not try looking for Juliana at a police station and instead should go to Ecuador's borders with Peru and Colombia, Cuenca or Ambato. When Margot asked why Juliana would be in any of these places or why she would not want to be found, Patricio responded by saying, quote, "Why are you doubting me? If you want to take me to jail, take me away at once." It seemed he did not want them to be at the Quito Police Headquarters or to see the CCTV footage. Much to the disappointment of Juliana's family, the CCTV footage did not seem to reveal much of anything. The next day, the prosecutor was finally handed the missing person report, and they assigned an investigator to the case. While the family was telling the investigator what had happened, Juliana's aunt received another call from Pastor Patricio. He told them that he had prayed for them extensively and that due to his prayer, they would actually hear from Juliana in 20 to 30 minutes. Immediately afterwards, Juliana's mother received a text message claiming to be from Juliana, which said, quote, "I'm fine. I'm in Cuenca. As soon as I know the address, I'll let you know. I don't have internet." The investigator, who was present when this happened, advised that they answer and call her to tell her that they were looking for her with the police. When they did call her cell phone, however, it was turned off and they could not contact her. They never received any further text messages. The investigator never suggested triangulating the transmission in order to see where the text was sent, and so the family was left with more questions than answers. Jonathan's sister, Michelle, soon called Juliana's mother and said that her daughter had posted a Facebook status that said, quote, "Thank you, friends, for your concerns. I made my own decisions, and I want you to respect them. Do not interfere in my life." Juliana's mother refused to believe that this was true and still found it suspicious that all the information about Juliana had come from Pastor Jonathan's family. Knowing her daughter's password, she attempted to log into her Facebook, only to find out that the password had been changed quite recently. A friend of Fabian's helped the family break into Juliana's Facebook account, and that was when they found the Facebook conversation that Juliana had had with the church psychologist, Juan Solano, back in December of 2011. Juliana's family read that in the last month, Juan Solano had sent a message which told Juliana not to leave the church, that her family belonged there, and that her mother was being selfish. He went on to say that, quote, "People who leave the church die," and that her heart was, quote, "leading her to the biggest mistake of her life," and that she and Fabian destroyed, quote, "what was prepared for her." Juan had also sent a threatening proverb, which said, quote, "Then they will call me, and I will not answer. They will look for me in the morning, and they will not find me, because they hated wisdom and did not choose the fear of the Lord." To Juliana's mother, this was very similar to how Jonathan spoke, and just like Juliana did half a year prior, she noticed that the profile picture resembled Jonathan as well. On July 11th, Juliana's mother went to police with these text messages in hand and asked the prosecutor to get a call log from Juliana's cell phone. She also requested that the IP addresses that had sent the text messages be traced and requested that they question Jonathan and the Carrillo family. The prosecutor agreed and did in fact question Jonathan and his family. They spoke ill of Juliana and her mother, calling them problematic and accusing them of having issues and domestic troubles. They also claimed that Juliana was hanging out with the wrong crowd. Jonathan, when asked why he was in the same area as Juliana on the day she was last seen, stated that he had just finished cleaning the church and later left to go to Patricio's house. He later, however, changed his story and said that he had actually gone to work at the National Institute of Meritocracy, where he was a systems engineer. Despite how suspicious they were acting, the prosecutor decided not to continue the investigation, stating that since he was also an evangelical, he'd have to ask his own pastor for permission to investigate another church family. He also stated that he was confident the Carrillo family was not responsible because they were pastors. The reluctance to investigate the pastors meant that the phone records and call logs were unable to be saved in time. On August 14th, even though the prosecutor had already ended the conversation, Pastor Jonathan went to the prosecutor's office to tell his version of events. He stated that on July 9th, Juliana had entered his office at the Meritocracy Institute unannounced in order to supposedly tell him that she was fine and just with friends. He then alleges that Juliana asked him as a pastor to keep her presence a secret, and despite him not being of the Catholic faith, and thus not bound to silence if anyone confesses something, Pastor Jonathan kept this information a secret. He went on to allege that Juliana then asked Jonathan if she could use his computer in order to post a Facebook status, and he claims that the girl promised she'd return home soon. Jonathan also admitted to the prosecutor that he had created the fictitious account of Juan Solano with the purpose of, quote, advising her or to suggest positive changes in her life, as Pastor Jonathan said that he saw Juliana was going through what he called multiple problems. Jonathan denied ever trying to pressure Juliana to marry his brother, and instead claims that he simply suggested that she meet with him to see if they could have a, quote, more serious relationship. When the prosecutor asked him if he had used this counseling technique with anybody else in his flock, he responded by saying that he had not. The prosecutor took his statement and sent him on his way, taking no further action. It took 2 years until there were any new developments in the case, but in 2014, Juliana's mother was finally able to get the IP addresses from where the text messages were sent that were supposedly from Juliana. Juliana's mother, much to her surprise, found that the text messages were sent from Jonathan's computer. As a result of this information, on May 18, 2014, the investigation into Juliana's disappearance was reopened, and an organized search was finally conducted, with the police finally searching a valley in Quito and a revive in Guangopalo, as Pastor Patricio had lived in that area. The police also raided Jonathan's house and seized all of his electronic equipment, such as his computer and his cell phones. While they found no evidence that Jonathan or Patricio had abducted Juliana, they discovered large amounts of pornographic images, in addition to photos and videos of Juliana and other girls from the church saved on his computer. Police then went to the Meritocracy Institute to check Jonathan's statement that he had given 2 years prior. The institute luckily still had their guest book from 2012 saved, and it showed that there were no records of Juliana visiting the premises, and none of Jonathan's coworkers recalled seeing her that day. Investigators also discovered that the clock-ins and clock-outs on the day that Juliana disappeared was doctored. They had been physically altered to make the start and end time of Jonathan's shift that day unknown. Throughout the interrogation, it was reminded to Jonathan that there are no seals of secrecy in evangelism, unlike in Catholicism. So, Jonathan instead opted to use his civilian right to remain silent. It was after this revelation that the case was finally starting to be taken seriously by authorities. And while the first prosecutor had refused to investigate any further due to his own religious beliefs, he was replaced at the family's request. However, going forward, there would not be one single prosecutor assigned to the case, but a variety of prosecutors, which led to administrative errors. From 2002 to 2017, 10 different prosecutors were assigned to the case, and due to their administrative actions, they were constantly being switched around and replaced. 8 different investigators were assigned by the various prosecutors to investigate, and over 90 different legal files were created. During the extensive investigation, numerous pieces of circumstantial evidence against Jonathan were discovered, but nothing could be conclusively tied to him or the crime. Prior to the realization that the IP addresses that sent Juliana's texts were from Jonathan's computers, a psychiatric evaluation was performed on Pastor Jonathan on September 16, 2013, and this examination had alarming results. When Jonathan was made to talk about the disappearance, the psychiatrist noted that he seemed highly agitated and nervous, and that he, quote, expresses discomfort, tries to have the appearance of spontaneity and ease. The emotional tension manifested is clearly observed with the trembling of his hands and jaw, tics in his mouth, and his way of avoiding visual contact. In addition, according to the report, the pastor contradicted himself numerous times. In one version, he described Juliana as the daughter of a dysfunctional family, but in another, he described her as a calm and consistent young woman in the church. The criminal profile generated by the psychiatrist portrayed Pastor Jonathan in a less than virtuous light. The profile indicated that Jonathan was frustrated and upset at Juliana's decisions, and that he had a misogynistic outlook on the world. It also said that he was plagued by obsessive thoughts, and the psychiatrist is quoted as saying in his report that Jonathan had, quote, instrumentalized a series of acts on Juliana Campoverde similar to those used by any coercive sect or cult. The person conducting the evaluation ended their report by stating that it was highly likely that Jonathan was responsible for Juliana's disappearance. In 2017, the police, using the IMEI code, were able to determine that Jonathan had been using Juliana's cell phone chip in his own phone in order to make a call to an operator and to review voice messages. They also determined that he was the one sending every single text message to Juliana's family. Despite the copious amounts of technological evidence against Pastor Jonathan, combined with the many amounts of circumstantial evidence at the time, the current prosecutor stated that the investigation could not move forward as there was no body. In January of 2018, the family requested that the prosecutor be replaced. So the Attorney General's office agreed and decided that this time they would make sure to choose their prosecutor carefully. They chose Mayra Soria to be the 11th prosecutor. She was chosen due to Mayra's history of prosecuting gender-based crimes, particularly female homicides in Ecuador. They also believed that Mayra was far more sympathetic to the family and more determined to see justice carried out than any of the prior prosecutors. Mayra asked Claro, a Brazilian-Mexican telecom company which operates in Ecuador, for their registry, but they no longer had possession of it on file as their system had automatically deleted it after a certain amount of time in order to free up space. Instead, Mayra requested a second search warrant for Jonathan's home, and on September 5, 2018, the police searched the pastor's home for a second time, this time finding the smoking gun. They seized a folder, and when opened, its contents revealed that Jonathan had requested a record of his phone calls back in 2012. The document that he requested lists the numbers that he had called during this time and the duration of each call, and it had the IMEI number attached to it. With that in mind, Mayra went back to Claro and asked if the IMEI and data from Jonathan's phone were correct, and Claro confirmed that it was. So Mayra requested from Claro a call log of Juliana's cell phone and found that her last call had been made the day of her disappearance and had come from Jonathan's IMEI number. Upon seizing his computer, they found that he would frequently search up things such as, quote, dead woman found in Quito, and other similar search queries. They also found that in 2012, Jonathan had been searching about scopolamine and how to prepare it. In addition, 500 gigabytes of pornography was found on his computer, the computer of a supposedly pious man who would often lecture the community on the evils of temptation. After Jonathan was arrested, he was taken to the Flagrancia unit in Quito, where his family and Juliana's parents both waited anxiously to see if the police would believe Jonathan's version of events and release him yet again. Pastor Patricio was present, and he seemed restless and nervous, pacing back and forth across the room with his hands behind his back, only occasionally stopping to talk to his family or check on the time. At one point, Pastor Patricio stopped to stare at Juliana's mother, who tried her best to stare back at him with defiance and courage. The county prosecutor interrogated Jonathan for 4 hours and asked him 98 questions, with most questions being focused around his relationship and history with Juliana. Jonathan continuously gave contradictory information, and when asked why Juliana's SIM card was registered to the IMEI of his phone, he only replied, quote, "I don't know," and stated that on the day of her disappearance, he had stayed at the Meritocracy Institute until 8 p.m. He was unable to provide a satisfactory explanation behind the connection of Juliana's SIM card to his phone number, and his behavior and actions indicated guilt to all present. Ultimately, the police and Myra, the prosecutor, did not believe him, and thus, on that same day, he was brought to court to finally be arraigned on charges of kidnapping. The judge thought that there was enough evidence to move forward and officially charged Jonathan with kidnapping. The prosecutor requested that he be held in pretrial detention, a request which the judge granted. The prosecutor soon gave a press conference, and it became a media sensation overnight. Throughout Ecuador, the case was heavily discussed. At a press conference, Juliana's parents thanked the prosecutor Myra and the police for their efforts. Elsewhere, however, Pastor Jonathan was denying the charges, and his family was professing his innocence, calling his arrest religious persecution. However, due to the reputation garnished by the press conference, Jonathan's family's church, Oasis de Esperanza, suffered, and their numbers diminished, with very few of its parishioners attending Mass and instead attending different churches. This angered Jonathan's family, as it ultimately affected their bottom line, their wallets. While he was kept in pretrial detention, the authorities would continue to interrogate Jonathan until eventually the pressure built up and he finally confessed. On November 10, 2018, he admitted that he had kidnapped Juliana, but that she had died accidentally during a fall, and that he had disposed of her body at a ravine in the Bella Vista neighborhood. Due to this confession, a major search operation would be conducted the following day, with Juliana's family and Jonathan, under police guard, taking part. Numerous officers, search dogs, and even an excavator were employed in the operation, utilizing 400 officers and investigators. However, while they descended down to the bed of the ravine and traveled several kilometers along the banks of the Machangara River, no evidence of Juliana was uncovered. Finally, on November 11th, those involved in the search discovered human remains in a field near the ravine, exactly where Jonathan said they would be found. However, the remains were not a complete set, with the police finding only a tooth, a jawbone, and a rib. Despite the low quantity of remains, there was still more than enough evidence in order to get a DNA sample. This DNA sample would be compared to Juliana's family. Meanwhile, the prosecutor would work on upgrading the charges against Jonathan from kidnapping to the offense of kidnapping resulting in death, which would carry a harsher sentence. On November 27th, the DNA results came back, and shockingly, they ended up not being a match for Juliana. Coincidentally, it appeared that the skeletal remains of an entirely different person were in the exact spot that Jonathan said Juliana would be. To this day, the remains have never been identified, and police could not determine the age of the skeleton, the cause of death, or even the gender. Investigators were also unable to compare the teeth for identification, as they could not locate Juliana's dental records. On November 30th, the charges against Jonathan were revised, and he was charged with kidnapping resulting in death, even with the absence of Juliana's body. Although the remains did not match Juliana, they still had Jonathan's confession. However, after the search, Jonathan again exercised his right to silence and refused to speak to investigators. Due to the extensive investigation, Jonathan's family had seen the writing on the wall, and Patricio and Israel, his father and brother, quickly fled Ecuador before the prosecution could call them to testify or possibly charge them as well. On December 28th, an arrest warrant was issued for the two, even though the prosecutor believed that the two likely fled to the United States. The whereabouts of Pastor Patricio and Israel are unknown to this day. On December 21st, the prosecution requested permission from a judge to excavate Jonathan's garden and search his home for forensic evidence. This request was granted, and police began to dig up Jonathan's yard in order to search for Juliana's remains, while forensic technicians examined the inside of his house via the use of luminol. The luminol, when sprayed, detected traces of blood in Jonathan's bathroom. The excavation of Jonathan's yard turned up no results, and there's no mention of blood samples matching Juliana, so it is assumed that they were not a match. On July 3, 2019, Jonathan's trial would finally commence. The defense's main argument was that the only crime Jonathan was guilty of was kidnapping, and that despite his confession, any evidence of him committing murder was all circumstantial due to the lack of a body. While the defense claimed that no body meant no crime, Myra, the prosecutor, argued that Jonathan was directly responsible for Juliana's death and sought the maximum sentence. She further requested that Juliana's family be paid the equivalent of $262,800 in compensation, and that the Oasis de Esperanza Church be shut down, and that the sentence be communicated throughout the evangelical organizations so that a crime like this would not be repeated. The prosecutor argued that although Jonathan was not a fully ordained pastor, he used his position of power in a religious organization in order to manipulate Juliana, who was deeply religious. The prosecutor also advocated for a registry of pastors to be created in order to have their ordination regularized. Although no body had been found, the first witness to be called to the stand was Luis Hueco, a forensic and medical examiner. The forensic examiner was questioned in regards to Jonathan's pretrial confession, which read, quote, "I defended myself to prevent her from continuing to attack me. I took her hands, and then I took her arm. I put my hands on her shoulder, I squeezed her neck, and in that struggle, after taking a step back, she fell, giving herself a hard blow to the head, after which she did not move." Jonathan stated that this happened in his driveway, and the medical examiner was asked if this version of events was possible. He stated that the possibility of a woman weighing 143 pounds or 65 kilograms, which was Juliana's weight, dying instantly from a fall such as the one that Jonathan described would not be medically probable. The medical examiner argued that if Juliana had fallen backwards and had suffered brain damage as a result of the fall, that she would have died days later and not instantly, as Jonathan claimed. The medical examiner argued that if Juliana had been pushed or had been strangled, such an injury could result in a compound fracture to the skull. However, this would not have been the result of an accidental fall. Juliana's mother, Elizabeth Rodriguez, was another witness for the prosecution. She told the court about Jonathan's manipulative tactics and stalkish behavior. She detailed how his family would repeatedly contact her in an attempt to disrupt or mislead the ensuing investigation and search, including how Jonathan's father called Juliana's aunt to tell her that 20 to 30 minutes from that conversation, she would hear from the missing Juliana, and how they later received a text purported to be from Juliana stating she was fine. It was only later in the investigation that they found out that Jonathan had been using his phone to send those text messages, and that Juliana had not only not been fine, but that she was already deceased by that time. The next witness called was Italo Rojas, who had performed the psychiatric evaluation on Jonathan in 2013. He testified that Juliana was the victim of psychological manipulation and that Jonathan had used her faith against her. He also testified that Jonathan, using the fake name of Juan Solano, had made Juliana feel guilty for having goals and aspirations outside of his church, and that he had presented himself with a supernatural image, one of great power, and of a prophet capable of having visions. The psychiatrist reiterated his opinion that the Oasis de Esperanza church was more like a cult than an actual church, and that Juliana had fallen victim. He also added that he believed Jonathan to have a, quote, hidden sexual desire for Juliana. Based on his search history leading up to and after Juliana's disappearance, coupled with his prior questionable relationship with Juliana, the prosecution argued that on July 7, 2012, Jonathan had approached Juliana alone and had drugged her with scopolamine before putting her into his vehicle and taking her to a motel where he may have attempted to have sex with her before killing her, possibly during an argument. The prosecution also called a telephone analyst to the stand who testified that Juliana and Jonathan's cell phones were both in the same area at the same time, and that their triangulation coincided with 4 different points, with it being likely that the last point was when Jonathan put Juliana's SIM card into his own phone. The defense questioned the validity of the text messages between Juliana and Juan Solano, and during cross-examination with Italio Rojas, the defense asked how he knew Jonathan was the one behind the Juan Solano account, to which the psychiatrist answered that Jonathan's wife, and Jonathan himself back in 2012, had confirmed that it was. The defense also asked the expert if Jonathan had ever verbally threatened Juliana in person, to which Italio Rojas responded that he had not heard of any instances of him threatening her in person. The defense pointed out that the chats were obtained via a result of the family utilizing one of Fabian's friends in order to break into her Facebook account, and therefore questioned the accuracy of the messages. The defense also stated that they had over 400 witnesses, but in the end, they only called 4 to the stand. One of the men called to the stand was Pastor Vicente Munoz, who was the national representative of the Foursquare Gospel Church, to which the Oasis de Esperanza, and by extension Jonathan and his family, belonged. He testified that he had only ever authorized Patricio Carrillo and his wife as pastors, and that he had never authorized any assistant pastors for the church. In regards to the supposed protection that Jonathan may have had as a pastor, the prosecution asked about the supposed seal of the confessional, as Jonathan years earlier had cited that as his refusal to testify. Vicente testified that the Foursquare Church did not have confidentiality for their confessions or their pastors. On July 17, 2019, 3 judges, after 5 hours, reached a decision and found Jonathan Carrillo guilty of kidnapping resulting in death and sentenced him to 25 years imprisonment. They ordered that Jonathan pay Juliana's family the equivalent of 100,000 American dollars in compensation, and suggested that a national registry of pastors be established. They also ordered that Oasis de Esperanza close its doors forever. While Juliana's body was never found, after 7 long years, her family was finally able to see justice. As part of the court agreement, the police are to continue searching until Juliana's body is found. Jonathan appealed his sentence, but on March 13, 2020, the provincial court rejected his appeal and added to the compensation agreement with the court, ordering that the Foursquare Gospel Community Church fund the construction of a memorial plaque at the old church location, which Jonathan used to claim to be pastor of. After this appeal, Jonathan again appealed his case, this time to Ecuador's Supreme Court. On November 16, 2020, they too rejected his appeal, which meant that Jonathan had exhausted all of his appeal routes and would remain imprisoned until his sentence was served. Due to the court order stating that the search for Juliana's body be continued indefinitely, regular meetings are scheduled to discuss where to search for next and how to further continue the search. On April 15, 2021, another massive search operation was conducted. Utilizing search dogs and hundreds of officers, police combed across the same area that Jonathan had originally mentioned in his confession. The search lasted for 3 hours, with police teams carrying out a sweep on a steep slope of the ravine in Bella Vista. And while they marked 6 points separated by about 50 meters each, using dogs trained to look for human remains, intensive investigation would uncover no further evidence. The most recent search was carried out in November of 2021, but was not met with any results. So far, Juliana's body has not been found. The identity, gender, age, and cause of death of the remains found during the November 2018 search, as well as the whereabouts of Patricio and Israel Carrillo, remain unknown. July 7, 2022 marked the 10th anniversary of Juliana's disappearance and likely murder.